Welcome to the Business as Mission podcast, dedicated to those who long to see God glorified in business and the nations reached for Christ. Your host is Mike Bayer, longtime BAM leader and founder of Third Path Initiative, an online education resource for starting and growing BAM businesses around the world.
Well, welcome to another episode of the Business as Mission podcast. I am here with a new friend of mine who I actually met when she was representing somebody else to me to get on the podcast, who you will hear soon in the coming weeks. Susan Fleming, you'll get a great bit of joy out of that. But then she come back and she said, hey, you know what? I think there's something I could say. And so we agreed to have her on. And so Sabrina Hammond, thank you so much for being here. Sabrina is the founder and leader of Kingdom Connections podcast and media agency. She's a passionately joyful Christian, fun to be with. And so I know you're going to enjoy having some time with her today. So Sabrina, first, thanks for being here, and give us a little background on you and Kingdom Connections. What's it really about?
Wow. Thank you so much, Mike, for having me on. I'm so excited to be here. So a little bit about Kingdom Connection. We have the privilege and honor of being able to serve kingdom women from all over the world who are usually coaches, authors, speakers. The common theme is they all have this burning desire, this to share the message that God has given them, whether that be through their business or their book, whatever it is that He's called them to share. And then we get to strategically connect them with people like yourself, with podcasts and podcast posts, and then other various media outlets, so that they can get in front of the people that God has called them to serve and to impact. So that's a little bit about what we do.
So it's, and I want listeners to catch that the focus, I don't know that it's limited to, but the focus is primarily women, promoting women's voices within the kingdom, which is truly needed. And I think we all know that. So how does that work? I mean, you kind of gave us the big picture, but take Susan, for example, who you introduced me to, and we did a podcast for her and with her. How does this work? How does it, if anybody listening out there, particularly a kingdom woman, as you use the term, how do they reach out to you? What do you do? You know, take away the mystery, make it unscary for them.
Okay, so when they first come to us, we really want to know not just what their message is, but we go before the Lord and ask Him, like, who is this person? For example, Susan, just asking the Lord, who is she? What do you say about her? And what is this message that you have given her? And really just sitting before the Lord and asking Him for wisdom and insight and that vision, as it talks about in Habakkuk, to write the vision and to make it plain. We want to be able to know what is the vision that God has for them. And sometimes they don't even know, like, what is the bigger picture? And so oftentimes God shows us like where He wants to take them, not just where we're starting, but where are they going? And it's always so exciting that God is taking them so much higher than they could even imagine. And so we start right there with getting to know them and their message, and then asking the Lord for that vision, and then really just starting where they are and finding those people that they need to connect with, those podcast hosts, that not only are they going to be able to be interviewed by these people, but these are people that perhaps need to be in their community, that maybe they need to partner with them or collaborate with them on something else. And so it's definitely more than just these one-off interviews that they're going to be on. It's about expanding their community and their collaborations and their partnerships, so that we can be the body, right? So that we can come together and do more together than we can on our own.
So it's not just, I'm a podcast marketer. I help people get onto a podcast. I mean, that's helpful, I'm sure, but it's much bigger than that, the way you just described it, of helping particularly, again, the women who have a message or have a heart or have a passion to really see the potential, to see what God has in it, as well as to make connections on their behalf, which is I have to give, and I'm going to give Sabrina credit. Not too many people get a cold call with me, and she did, and we had a great time. It was absolutely delightful. Let her call you. If she calls you, you'll enjoy the conversation. So that alone is worthwhile, right? To help people that aren't good self-marketers to get to the community, the target audience that they need to get to. So I'm going to pursue that just a little bit. We didn't talk about this earlier, but I'm curious, what is it, do you think, that holds some of these women back? I mean, I know, for example, again, Susan, who you introduced me to, very talented, very intelligent, very gifted, very on fire for the Lord. And yet she, I guess, and I'm not picking on her, but she's just who I know, needed something to get beyond where she was. What are the things that you feel like are the obstacles or the barriers that some of the women that you serve, that they have, that you help them with? And you mentioned one, when you say that they may not even be sure exactly who they are. They may not really understand what God has in store. So helping somebody think through that is a really beautiful thing. But what do you see as their challenges?
I think sometimes it's a two-part, because what I find is that they all are relational. Like, they're wanting to build relationships with people, but that takes time. And so it's like this, being in this place where I know God is calling me higher, but what does that even look like? I know that he's expanding my territory and my reach, but okay, like what do I do with that? And so sometimes they know that God is calling them to speak elsewhere, but they don't even know where to start. They don't have the capacity to really build these relationships, find these people and connect with them in a very real and authentic way. Like, they don't want to sell themselves to everyone. Like, that's not their heart and that's not their desire. They want to connect with the people that they can build relationships with. But as you know, like, that takes time. And that's why we only serve a specific number of people. Like, we can't serve everybody at one time because we can't personally connect with all of their people at the same time. But it's like, that's why we deep dive into their message and to who they are, so that when we're reaching out, it's like we carry their heart, for them. We're going before them as if it's them, with their passion and their heart and their desire to reach people. And so sometimes it's just time, but it's not even knowing where to start. But you know that God's got something bigger for you. And you know that as soon as you step into that next, you take that next step, like, he's going to give you the next step. But it's up to you to give God your yes. And I think that's what they're doing. They're coming to us and they're saying, okay, God, this is scary. Like, I don't even know where we're going, but I'm giving you my yes. And I'm going to show up and I'm going to speak wherever you call me to go. And I'm just going to trust you. And it's an exciting adventure. It really is.
No, I could see that. And I'm thinking about most of the Christians I know, they really don't want to self-promote, whether they think it's prideful or a false humility, or just, like you say, they just don't know what to do. They really want to speak everywhere. They want to share their gift. They want to share their burden. And yet it's like, okay, now what? I mean, it's, and I'm thinking about one of the fun stories of Christian history was how Billy Graham got started. He was a traveling evangelist that no one knew. I mean, no one knew who he was. He was just nobody. And he was preaching in California, in Los Angeles, and Randolph Hearst, the great newspaper owner, heard him and went back to the paper and mentioned to his staff. He said, basically, the directive was, push Graham, build Graham. And it's one of those things, we know God did it, but had Hearst not caught this vision and used his platform to promote Billy Graham, I mean, I know God could have done it another way, but that's how God did it, right? And so you look at, here's now probably one of the most famous Christian leaders in our lifetime, and that's what God used to turn the corner, to the point now that they're debating about putting a statue of him in the Capitol, which is amazing to think about. So in a way, that's kind of what you're doing. You're hearing God say, all right, promote this person. I mean, push sounds really salesy, but you're a salesy person. I mean, you're not shy. You have no issue talking with people and sharing. Especially, it's interesting. You seem so passionate about sharing other people's stories, and you're just so joyful in doing it, so energetic in doing it.
And it's really because that's where all of this started. It was with somebody, my very first client, before it was even Kingdom Connections. I was operating under Sabrina's consulting services because I started a business because God said to do it. And I was like, I have no idea how to do this. And he just like, well, what do you know how to do? What can you offer somebody? And so I started out doing like a VA service, virtual assistant online, because I had administrative skills. And so this lady that went to our church, she connected with me and asked me to do some administrative work for her business. And we got to know each other. And long story short, she shared a testimony that was really part of her son's story about his relationship with the Lord. And I was in a really rough place at that time, like just struggling with my relationship with God. And I was having a hard time going to him. You know, with all the things I was dealing with, I really felt like I had to get it together first. And something that she shared was all about how he would just run to God, like run to him with everything. He was struggling with like addiction and all these things that I wasn't struggling with, but I knew about that whole I can't go to God thing. And something went off on the inside of me. Like it almost like something clicked. And I thought, wow, if he's struggling in addiction, and he can go to God with that kind of stuff, that means I can go to him. I can go to him with everything. And honestly, it unlocked something on the inside of me. And the relationship that I had with the Lord at that time was very different than what it is right now. And as soon as I started going to him, like that testimony impacted me, like it changed my life. And so with that, I said, you know, this right here, people in the church need to hear this. They need to hear this testimony. And she said, yeah, God told me I'm supposed to be sharing it. And out of nowhere, I said, can I help you do that? Can I help you share this message? Because it's powerful. And that's where it started right there. It was one testimony that changed my life, that God used her to speak to me. And so I know the power of our message and our stories. And I think that's God sends these women to me, but actually they're pouring into my life. So their stories are depositing things on the inside of me that are helping me along in my journey. And so I'm like, I understand the power of their message. So it's so fitting for me to go ahead and like share this with other people, because I can tell them this is powerful, and I know personally. So that's kind of the beginning. And I don't know. I just really felt led to share. Like that's how it started. It started with one person's testimony.
Well, in a way, isn't that kind of what evangelism is? It's what one beggar telling another beggar where the bread is, right?
Yeah.
You were blessed. This wasn't just a business idea. You were blessed. Obviously, you got a passion that says, you know what? I got to figure out a way to get these other people's messages out. And, you know, now it's working and people are being blessed. In a minute, I want to ask you specifically about, you know, how to impact the business's mission community. But let's start just for a moment, unpack the power of connection. I love that your company is called Kingdom Connections Podcast and Media Agency. And the heart of it obviously is connections, Kingdom Connections. So unpack that just a little bit and explain how you see that, how God's taught you about the power of connections.
Well, honestly, I keep going back to where it talks about in the Word about the body and operating as the body. And I feel like that was foundational when all of this started, is realizing that God wants to connect people, that this is not just about interviews. This is not just about one person getting, you know, these individual people getting their messages out. It is because he wants to bring people together for such a time as this, because when we operate together as a body, there's so much more that we can do. And I've seen this over and over and over again, that these women that he's bringing, they become like my family. We become this community, and something that we have just started doing, that God said we're supposed to start, is this. We come together once a month for prayer and praise via Zoom. Mm-hmm. And what I'm seeing is that God wants to connect the clients that I serve, like he wants to bring them together. because they're supposed to pour into each other. And there is a strengthening and an uplifting that happens when we come together, and you realize that not only are we not alone, we're not doing this all on our own, but there's ideas that all of a sudden begin to come forth in these little sessions that we have, or these conversations that we have. And all of a sudden, it's like our one thing that God dropped in our spirit has turned into something so incredible that we could never have thought of that on our own. And that is the power of collaboration and connection. It's operating as the body.
It's interesting as you say that. Just a quick rabbit trail. I have been just finished reading James Bryan Smith's series, Good and Beautiful God, Good and Beautiful Life, and Good and Beautiful Community. And the last one is really about the body. The first one is about who is God. The second one is about who are you in Him. And the third one is about, what are you a part of? And I think it's fascinating, just to your very point there, that he camps on the word community versus church. And part of that is because for most people, when you think church, even though we know better, you still think building, right? I mean, it's ingrained deep in our brains. And so you say, well, I'll meet you at the church versus, and so it's just a lot of people losing or missing out on the fact that it's not church. In fact, that's not even the right word. That's not even, the word is ecclesia. And the concept of assembly or community is really what's there. And so when he keeps coming back to that, it's blessed me a lot to just really use that word, the community word, to replace the church word. And the community of believers, they happen to be in that building on a Sunday morning, perhaps, but you convene them on Zoom, and that's the same thing. And that's what we're seeing around the world. Most of the people in our circles are not connected overseas to traditional churches, and I'm doing air quotes. The listeners can't see that, but I'm doing it. Because many of them work among unreached people groups. They're in places that you can't legally be a Christian, or you can't legally evangelize, or you're very restricted in what you can do. And so, when they're not living traditional church. I remember some good friends of mine years ago were working in, as we always called it, the big country in Southeast Asia. Wink, wink, and everybody's like, "Oh yeah, we know what that is." But and then they would come home, and they were just so joyful to be in a community of believers who could openly worship and sing and pray, and because they couldn't do that where they lived, and so that's not uncommon at all.
We'll be right back after a short break. Third Path Initiative is your go-to site for accessible, affordable BAM training. Learn about the biblical foundations for business as mission, ethical capitalism, BAM strategies, and how to become a kingdom employee. It's all at thirdpathinitiative.com.
All right, so let's in the interest of the timeliness of this podcast, let's talk about you and the business as mission community. And we chatted about this earlier. The business as mission community is not well defined. I mean, it's everything from marketplace ministry, serving Christ where you are in the marketplace, recognizing that business is a call from God. It's not just something you do to make money so you can give it to the church. It's a call. There's an intentionality to it. People are doing it here in the States. They're doing it in other, I'll call them Christianized countries like the UK and Australia. But they're also doing it in places that you can't go as a missionary. So they're going, using business, doing business as a reason to be there, not just a strategy to be there, but a reason to be there, build relationships and live out the gospel and help make disciples. Many of them have a great story to tell. Many of them have products that are beautiful products, and but they have a hard time getting it to market from Africa or Southeast Asia or wherever. So just in general, I guess, Sabrina, when you think about that particular audience, and many of them are women. This is not a male-dominated thing. In fact, I would say most of the impressive missionaries I've met over the years were women, and certainly many of the impressive businesses mission practitioners are women. Many of them are working among women. I think about the Freedom Business Alliance, which is focused on salvaging people from human trafficking, which is, these things are disastrously ugly. And these folks have gone in using business to work in those settings. So I'm painting you a picture of, gosh, there's a lot of story to tell here. So let me shut up now and say, okay, two questions. Number one is how can what you do help them? And secondly, very practically, very, very logistically, how can they get in touch with you? How can they have a conversation to find out what their next step might be?
I think that what I have noticed since probably about 2020 and maybe even before that is this whole world of podcasting is exploding. And perhaps it was at the start of the pandemic, people were online and they started, but I didn't even know what a podcast was at that time. and now I've come to realize that there are just hundreds of thousands of podcasts out there. And this is an incredible way for people to get their story and their message out to the world. Because
let me jump in here. I want to ask you a question. Something you just said. So yes, hundreds of thousands of podcasts, at least. I mean, we don't know. So the first thing that would make me think, and I'd like you to answer this because I know other people are going to think the same way. It's like, well, no room for me in this. I mean, how do you make a noise in that vast ocean of sound? And I know you know the answer, but I bet you there's people thinking, yeah, I do a podcast, but there are hundreds of thousands. That's not really for me. How would you, and I'll come back, I don't mean to interrupt you, but I couldn't let that slide.
It really makes me think of all of these very, I'm not going to say weird, but incredibly niche and specific podcasts that I have come across that I would have thought, oh my gosh, there's an audience for that. And it makes me think of I've come across some that are about dogs and dog parents. And I know that sounds very kind of that's very specific. And what I think of too is that there's billions of people all over the world and we are all unique and different. And so if you're thinking there's not a place for you, that's absolutely not true. There is a place because somebody somewhere is wanting to hear that unique and incredible message. And it's not just content, it's your story that's going to resonate. It's not, the how-tos or whatever, the content that people are putting out, because you may never remember the content, but what you remember is their story. That's what connects people. And so you have no idea who could be listening. And it could just be one person, but it only takes one person to have a ripple effect. But your one message to get across the world to that one person somewhere on the other side of the world that's listening, that resonates. And oh my gosh, it changes their life. And they reach out and, I don't know, maybe you end up doing something together, but it's our stories that connect. And there's absolutely a place for everyone. Because, there's even podcasts that just want to feature stories. That's all they do. They want to feature diversity and stories and messages of everybody. And then there are those that are incredibly specific. If you're passionate about board games or video games or there's a podcast for you. There's people that are passionate. So I think there's an incredible opportunity. And so you can't look at it as there's so many that I can't. No, there's so many. You can find where you fit. You can find your people because they're there. Or maybe you can't find them because God wants you to start a podcast.
Uh-huh. I'm really glad you went there. I like I say, I apologize for interrupting, but it just struck me all of a sudden that I bet there are many, many people that, yeah, I'd love to tell the story on podcasts. Not only do I not know how to do it, but there's so many. I just be one more drop in the ocean. But I think your answer, I love that. If you have a story to tell, there's somebody who needs to hear that story.
That's right.
And I know that's the heart and soul of the Business is Mission podcast. We actually sort of advertise it as band stories because I can teach on Business is Mission all day long. I can give you a theology of business all day long. And that's great. You need to have good biblical, spiritual thinking about this. But when you hear the story of some of our guests and they're just telling their story, you realize wow, God is at work. He's at work in this person. He could be at work in me. And it's really inspiring. So I'm with you on that. So let's get back to everybody has a story. And that's why, there are thousands about that. That's why I interrupted you. So let's pick it up from there and let's continue.
Yeah, so everybody has a story, which really leads me to the podcast that we just launched, which is Kingdom Connection podcast, which we are wanting to feature the stories and the testimonies of people from all over the world. So that's just one platform, literally just one platform, that God is calling us to use to feature those stories. And then not only that, but to use that to build those bridges, to make those connections for people. Because honestly, sometimes it can feel like, and I'm thinking about the people that you mentioned that are in countries that are not open to the gospel. It can feel like you're very much alone in what you're doing because you're not surrounded by that community because it's very closed. And so you only have a few people. But there's something very powerful that happens when you show up and you share your message on a podcast and somebody somewhere listens and there's connections that can be made. And I know that's where God is going to allow us to make those connections for people, to introduce people, because it's not just the sharing your message, but it's about making those connections. And so if you're somebody somewhere in a remote country that's not open to the gospel and you feel like you're alone, but then you get out there and you share what you're doing. This is what God has called me to do. And maybe you don't share all the specifics because I don't know how that, you can only share so much when you're very close like that. But maybe there's somebody on the other side of the world that's listening and then somehow wants to partner with them. So now you're locking arms with another believer. And maybe it's just that they want to be praying and interceding for them. But that's the power of showing up and sharing your message. And then making those connections.
While you're talking, I was thinking about, I've been a Christian for coming up on 50 years. I became a Christian at university when I was 19, and it was very quickly introduced to the missional movement of the day. And my heroes were missionaries. And the way we got that way was through missionary biography, two things. Missionary biographies, where they're telling their story, or someone's telling their story, or missionary visits to the church where they're telling their story. In those days, it really flooded my world, and I think my generation's world, with this heart for world missions. That's how I got connected to what I'm doing now, from hearing a story about what God was doing in the Soviet Union. Just all these things happen, and you see this, you're like, wow, that's pretty amazing. People don't. Now, two things here. Young people don't read much anymore. Sadly, but they don't. So I don't know how many are out there, in the 20s and 30s, which is the future generation of missions leaders. How many of them are reading missionary biographies? Some, but I bet not all that many. They're listening, right? Yeah. They're listening to podcasts or they're going to YouTube. I mean, it's not that they don't care. They just have a different way of taking in the information. So
that's right.
So to me, that's like, okay, how does somebody, not just somebody with a great message in general, life-changing message, but in the business mission world, how do they inspire others to consider this pathway? Or in the Freedom Business Alliance world, the anti-slavery, people don't know, 40 million slaves in the world today, right? How do they tell the stories? And you're answering this in such a powerful way that we can impact the next generation through this media, which look, I'm almost 70 years old. I love podcasts, but I'm not a media guy. But the young people are. This is a phenomenal tool to share the story, not just your story, but as you said earlier, to impact their lives in ways that we can never imagine.
That's right. And I think it starts with, first, how are you the hands and feet of Jesus, wherever you are? Like, this is not complicated. This is not, I'm not talking to missionaries. I'm talking to the body, right? Ecclesia, the people. How are you being the hands and feet of Jesus where you are? That's your message. That's your story right there. And you show up and you share that. And you may diminish and think that this is not really a big deal or whatever, but that's what I want to speak to. Like, it's not complicated. It's us being the hands and feet of Jesus, sharing what we're doing with other people, because maybe somebody wants to partner with us, or maybe God would have us to do something even bigger together, again, as the body. And you're right, like, use what we have right now. Where are people at? They're listening, they're watching, they're not really reading so much anymore. So why not just use the tools that we have, that people are interested in watching and listening, to further the kingdom?
Amen. Preach it. That'll work. All right, so we've come up kind of on our time limit for this episode anyway, and I want to ask you to share, as we wrap up, how does somebody that's listening to this that says, wow, I'm excited about the possibility of getting the story out, and not having to promote myself, but to really share, what God is doing in my life, in the hopes that it will encourage someone else to not maybe do the same thing, but maybe just to say, Lord, what do you have for me? To just get that dialogue started with God. How does somebody out there listening to this, and they may be in the U.S., they may be in the West, they may be, in West Africa, they may be in a Muslim country, how do they find out more about you? And I'll put all this in the show notes, but how do they find out more about you? How do you want them to reach out? What's a good way to connect with Kingdom Connections?
Well, if they're able, I would love for them just to reach out to me personally on Facebook, Sabrina Hammond, because I am personal. I love to hear from people. I love to hear their stories. And I would just encourage them to start where they are with their own story and their own message. So what tools do they have access to? Can they go live on Facebook to just start getting their message out there? Sometimes that just kind of, that gets your foot in the door, so to speak, because now people can hear you. You're using your voice. Can you start a podcast? I mean, is that an avenue that you have? Or maybe the podcast that you're listening to that you feel like you could contribute, like you could add value. Be a guest. Like, there's so many different avenues, but it doesn't have to be complicated. And you just start where you are. And if you're just like, I don't know, but maybe we could have a conversation, and I would love to have a conversation with them, and just to maybe give them some ideas about how to get started right now, right where you are with your message.
So I love that. Just let's talk, right? That's kind of the application here, is just reach out. Let's have a conversation. Let's connect. And let's just see. And I can tell the audience, while Sabrina is a bold person in terms of outreach, she's not obnoxious. She's not going to beat you up. She's not going to sell you something. And I mentioned earlier, she's really a joy to talk to. And this is our third conversation. And every time we connect, it's like, okay, you're a good person to have in my life. So I'm thankful for that. So I'll put all this in the show notes. And you say right now, just go to Sabrina Hammond's on Facebook, connect out. And that's a good way to start. And just about anybody in the world knows how to do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So Sabrina, what's the last word from you? And then we'll wrap up.
Wow. I just want to remind you, wherever you are, your message matters, because you matter to God, and what He has given you is not just for you, it's for somebody else. So get out there and do what God has called you to do.
What a great way to end. I love it. Sabrina, thanks so much for being with us. Thanks for sharing this. And I'm really hopeful that some of our listeners will start reaching out and connecting and just listening to what God has for them in this regard of telling their story.
Thank you so much, Mike. This has been such a joy.
Well, I would tell our listeners, just spread the word. Give us a rating when you listen. We're on all the major platforms. And, of course, you can also get it through Anchor, where we started. But you can get it on Apple. You can get it on Spotify. You can get it on Google. It's all out there. Listen, download, share it. Give us a rating. Just, again, help us get the story out. We're telling other people's stories, just like you heard today. And then I encourage you, reach out to Sabrina, learn more, and to see if there's something there, a connection that would be beneficial to you, to her, and to the body. So, again, thanks so much, everybody, and we will look forward to our next guest soon. Sabrina, you're the best. I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to the Business as Mission podcast. We invite you to become part of the story by supporting the BAM podcast at patreon.com/BAM Stories. There's a link in the notes with this episode. For more information, go to thirdpathinitiative.com or tryventure.com. Please share this podcast and give us a review wherever you listen.